So we're now ready to create a line chart that's going to help us understand exactly what types of renewable energy are used in the US and how those have been growing over the years. So I'm going to switch over to the Acrobat file just to kind of see exactly what this final chart is going to look like. You'll see, by the way, that I was starting my original sketches. I thought that this would be one nice chart to work with. However, I realized after I kind of started to do my initial sketches that hydropower is really completely almost off the chart, literally, than the others. And that's what inspired me to put the country list kind of right there in that space in the middle, which we'll get to later on. But I also wanted there to be some kind of way where we can make this almost interactive in the final version of the PDF, where perhaps I can start to compare the growth of some of these renewable sources of energy. Like, for example, only display solar and wind, so I can clearly focus on just those two. So again, later on in the project, we're going to come back and see how we can use layers inside of Illustrator and also layers inside of Acrobat to help create that type of interactive PDF document. But for now, we actually want to get started creating this chart. So I'm going to switch back to Illustrator. And the first thing I'm going to do is actually start creating my chart. So here inside the Tools panel, I'm going to click over here where it says the Graph Tools. All the graph tools are here. I'm going to scroll down to where it says Line Graph Tool because that's the kind that we want to create. And keep in mind, by the way, if you decide later on to change your mind, remember that you can always change between different graph types inside of Illustrator, and the data will update accordingly as long as you don't ungroup your graph. I need to define an area or a size for the chart that I want to create. Now, I already have created this background here. It's actually going to go from 0 over here all the way up to 300,000, which is this part here. So I want my chart to be basically from here to here in a vertical fashion, but in a horizontal fashion, I kind of want it to start right about over here, but I want to leave some room here on the right side for me to put my labels. So I'm going to start by drawing a rectangle. I'm going to start right about over here. Again, it doesn't make a difference exactly where you are. We can always position and adjust this later on. But I'm somewhere here around 1/4 of an inch in from the edge over here. If you look at my little cross here in the ruler, I'm about 3/4 of an inch. And I'm right about over here. So I'm going to go ahead now and click and then drag to define the area of my chart. I'm going to bring it to about 9 inches right here. I'm going to go ahead and let go, and that brings up my data window. And I want to import some data. So I'll click on the button over here to import data. I'm going to navigate to the data folder here inside my exercise files. Now remember, when I'm placing data inside of Illustrator, I can't use a native Excel document, so I'm going to click on the text folder. And I'm going to click on this file here called US Renewable Energy Generation. I'm going to click Open, and that data now gets pasted here inside of my file. These numbers actually represent millions of kilowatt hours, which I already have written out inside of this chart. And you can see that I've also put the years that appear here on the left side in quote marks, meaning that I don't want these to be interpreted as values. I want those to be actually added to the axis along the bottom of my chart. So those should be the labels. Of course, these labels here are actual letters, not numbers, so Illustrator is automatically going to know that those should be charted as labels as well. There is a single decimal point here, and I really don't need to have the decimal points in this chart, so I'm just simply going to click on this button right here, Cell Style, change the number of decimals to 0, click OK. And by the way, if some of these numbers were really larger, I can also go back here and just increase the column width to say support maybe 10 digits. And that way I'm just sure that there's enough room and that nothing is getting truncated. Now that these values are here, I'm going to click on the check mark to go ahead and apply those settings to my chart. So I have what I need here. I'm going to close my data window, but you can see a couple of things here that are just really not working. First of all, obviously the styling doesn't look at all what I want it to look like, and we'll start to take steps to improve that momentarily. But I first want to get the scale correct. I'm going to go into outline mode for a second because Illustrator is using some default grayscale settings for the text here, which is on this background, so it's hard for me to read it. But I'm just showing you that if you look over here across the bottom, you'll see all the correct numbers of the years. But also, if you look on the left here, because Illustrator automatically chose the values that appear along this side of the chart or along this axis, it goes from 0 all the way to 350. Now it's doing that because Illustrator is simply taking the next larger number than the highest value in the chart, which is right about over here. But remember, we can define our own. So I'm going to go back and hit Command-Y or Control-Y to go back into preview mode. Next, I'm going to go to the Object menu. I'm going to choose Graph. And then I'm going to choose Type, because I want to modify some of the settings inside the chart. For the menu over here where it says Graph Options, I'm going to click on that. I'm going to choose Value Axis. And here, where it says Tick Values, I'm going to choose to override the calculated values. Now the minimum is 0, and I want it to stay at 0, but I don't want the maximum to go to 350,000, which is more than the existing setting inside this chart. In fact, let me just take you back for a second here. I'm going to click Cancel. And let's actually go back, Object, Graph, Data. And I'll show you over here where it says hydropower. And I look at the last date, which is 2011, which is representing this value right over here. You can see that that is the largest number inside the chart, 325 and change. And that's why Illustrator chose to go all the way up to 350,000 so that there's room inside the chart to display all these values. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to choose a value that's smaller than that. And that's going to force that value to like stick out of the graph, to go higher than the graph itself, to exceed the boundaries that I've already defined for that graph. And that will make that value stand out. So for example, I may choose 300,000. So let me close this window here. Let's go back to Object, Graph, and choose Type. Let's choose Graph Options and choose Value Axis. I'm going to override my calculated values. I'm going to leave the minimum setting at 0, but I'm going to change the maximum value to 300,000. I'm also going to change the number of divisions to 6 so that they're distributed evenly. Basically, every 50,000, I want there to be another line or another tick mark. And I'm going to click OK. So now, by the way, if you take a look over here on the left side, you can start to see that the tick marks inside of this chart are lining up to the ones that already exist in the background. You can also see that the value that appears here all the way at the top for hydropower actually jumps outside the bounds of the chart. Notice over here the chart kind of ends right here, but this goes outside of it because I've now defined what those values are. And again, if I go into outline mode by pressing Command Y or Control Y, you can now see that I've basically overridden those tick mark values. And I've told Illustrator to start at 0 and then use 50,000 increments, basically, to get to 300,000. And because this number is somewhere around 325,000, it basically jumps outside the bounds of the chart. I find that it's visually appealing. It kind of adds a dimension. It almost makes this kind of jump out at you and lets you know that, hey, hydropower is obviously very important and it's growing. I'm going to press Command Y or Control Y to go back to preview mode. And let's actually start to style this chart now as well. So I'm going to switch to my direct selection tool. And in reality, there's two ways to do what I'm about to do. I can use the group selection tool, and I can also use the direct selection tool. I'm actually going to start with the group selection tool first, but then I'm going to show you how you can also use the regular direct selection tool. I'm going to click on this blank area to deselect everything. Now what I want to start doing is actually stylizing the lines inside of this chart. So since I have the group selection tool selected right now, I can start by clicking in the legend area to help me select other parts of the chart. So for example, I'm now going to click once on this line right here, and that's simply going to select this one line. But if I click now a second time, you can now see that this line representing the data for the hydropower series has now also become selected. So the way the group selection tool works is that it allows you to click on one object, and then the second time you click on it, it basically moves one step up and selects everything else inside of that group. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the stroke weight. Right now you can see that the stroke weight is set to 2 points. I'm going to change that to 4 points in weight, so it's a much thicker stroke. I'm also going to click on the word stroke right here to open the stroke panel. And I just want to make sure that the cap setting is set to round cap. And that just makes the areas where the joins appear, meaning between each of these segments, just seems to be a lot smoother. Now I also want to change the color of this to match the color that I've set for hydropower. So I'm going to click on the actual stroke icon right over here. That brings up all of my swatches. And I've defined a color group for the renewable energy chart. And because right now I have the hydropower line selected, I'm going to choose the hydropower color right here. So let's do the same thing now for wind. I'm going to come over here and basically deselect everything. Just click on a blank area. I'm going to click once on this line for wind. And again, I can see that it's wind. If I go into outline mode, I can see the word wind here, just in case the colors are hard to read. Again, I click once on that line to select that line, and I click another time on that line to select the entire series. I change the stroke weight to 4 points, and then I change the stroke color to the wind color. Now for the remaining three, I'm going to show you the other method for selecting this by using the regular direct selection tool and not the group selection tool. And the reason why I'm showing this to you is because most likely, in day-to-day use inside of Illustrator, you're switching back and forth between the selection tool and the direct selection tool. So having to also every once in a while select the group selection tool is just another tedious thing to do. So there is a keyboard shortcut or a modifier key that will allow you to access the group selection tool, or more specifically, it allows you to specify that the direct selection tool behaves like the group selection tool. And the way that you do that is you press and hold down the Option key while the direct selection tool is active. So just to show you here, if I click and hold on the direct selection tool, you see the group selection tool is basically the same arrow but with a plus sign next to it. Well, if I have my direct selection tool active right now, but I hold down my Option key, on Windows that would be the Alt key, you'll see the plus sign appear. This means that now my direct selection tool behaves like a group selection tool. So here's what I do. I move over here and I hold down my Option or Alt key and I click on the line for biomass. I then click a second time and now that selects the entire series. Now I'll change the stroke weight to 4 point. I'll hit the Tab key, and then I'll change the color here to the biomass color. Let's do that to the final two series here. I'm going to click on an empty space here to basically deselect everything. Hold down my Option or Alt key, click once, twice. I've now selected the series for geothermal. I'll change the stroke weight to 4 points, and I'll change the color to the geothermal color. Finally, again, click on a blank space here, deselect everything. Option or Alt click on the line for solar PV, click once, click another time again. Notice here the series has now become selected down here. Change the stroke weight to 4 points and change the stroke color to the solar PV color. So we've now been able to successfully add a line chart to our document here inside of Illustrator, and we've also colored all the lines for the series. But I'll tell you that all these little squares that appear here for the actual data points look pretty ugly. And we want to replace them with something that looks nicer with our design. So in the next movie, we're going to define something called a marker for these charts and replace all of these ugly little squares with pretty little circles. So let's go ahead and choose File, Save As. We want to save our work where we are right now. Let's change this to Renewable Energy 03. Click Save to save this in our exercise files. Click OK after this dialog comes up. And now we're ready to create our markers.